So we'll kick off with a brief introduction to CDP and CDSB. Then we'll look into a little bit more detail at the TCFD recommendations themselves. And then we're going to look at the political landscape for mandatory reporting. We're going to look at a number of different countries that either have regulation in place around this topic, and plus what signals we're seeing for future legislation as well. So I believe I will hand over to Mike for a brief introduction on CDSB.
Thank you very much, Jenny, and welcome everyone. I'd like to begin by introducing you to CDSB, the Climate Disclosure Standards Board. We are a consortium of 9 business and environmental NGOs who were set up in Davos in 2007 with a mission to provide decision-useful environmental information to markets via the mainstream corporate report, that is the annual report of companies. Our board is listed on the screen, and you can see a small sample of our technical working group. We are very lucky to have the support of experts in this field, both in the financial and the non-financial reporting field, both from the private sector as well as academia and other fellow NGOs. And we work together to produce technical guidance and a framework to report climate change and environmental information to primarily an investor audience in the mainstream corporate report of companies. And with that short introduction, I'll hand back to Jenny.
Thanks. And so a brief introduction to CDP now. CDP was founded in 2000. We're a global not-for-profit organisation, and we work with investors, companies, cities, states and regions to enable them to measure and to manage their environmental impact. We see information as being the fundamental basis for action. So we aim to make environmental reporting mainstream, and we want to provide detailed insights to drive action for a climate-safe, water-secure and deforestation-free world. We started with just a few hundred companies disclosing via the CDP system back in the early 2000s. And last year in 2018, we had 750 cities, states and regions doing the same. So we leverage investor and buyer power to motivate companies to disclose this information. And in 2018, we aligned the CDP information request to companies with the recommendations of the TCFD, which Mike will run through in a bit more detail.
Thank you very much, Jenny. I'm sure you are all familiar with the TCFD recommendations, but I wanted to give you a bit of a recap. So, I'm sure you all know, the TCFD recommendations came from the G20's Financial Stability Board, an organization that was set up after the 2008 financial crisis to deal with macroprudential, market-wide financial stability issues. Mark Carney, the Governor of the Bank of England and at the time Chair of the Financial Stability Board, has commissioned this task force and has appointed Michael Bloomberg as the chair. And it was a group of private sector actors working on climate-related financial reporting and producing recommendations on these by the private sector for the private sector. They were designed to be voluntary in the first instance, but as we'll show you today, there has been significant government and regulatory interest already. The recommendations were set up to provide climate-related financial disclosures in the annual financial filings or mainstream reports of companies, and the recommendations also provide additional guidance for the financial sector and other high-risk non-financial sectors where climate change is especially material. The recommendations focus on transition and physical risks and opportunities, transition risks being those that are associated with the transition to a low-carbon economy, and physical risks are self-explanatory, of course. There is a strong focus on forward-looking information, and the recommendations also include a recommendation to disclose the outcomes of scenario analysis, that is to sort of provide a picture of the resilience of the organization's business model and strategy going forward in various futures or scenarios. They cover the short term, medium, and long term, looking forward. And of course, they provide qualitative and quantitative disclosures as well. Over to you, Jenny.
Thank you. So I'm going to take a little look at exactly how CDP is working with the TCFD recommendations. So we provide a platform for disclosure of environmental impact information, as I mentioned before, and we analyze and score the information that's disclosed through the system and provide that to stakeholders to enable them to use these insights to manage and take action to reduce those impacts. So as you can see from this slide, we've taken the recommendations of the TCFD on what companies and investors should be evaluating. We've broken them down into accessible and actionable metrics in the form of CDP questions within the request for information that we send annually. We also provide CDP guidance to companies on how to do this, and then resources to take action on each metric. Companies then provide data on their environmental impacts, including around their risks, their opportunities, their strategies, as outlined in the slide previously by Mike, and the end product is then comparable, standardized, decision useful data which can be used by investors to make informed decisions around investment engagement and to drive action. Mike's going to talk now through how the CDP and CDSB systems work together in relation to the TCFD.
Thank you, Jenny. As Jenny has mentioned, of course, the CDP questionnaire has been aligned with TCFD recommendations, and the CDSB framework is, of course, also aligned with the TCFD recommendations. And it's helpful to think about these two tools that are available to you as helpful processes and tools to help you implement the TCFD recommendations. As Jenny mentioned, of course, the CDP system helps companies to generate the information they need, structure it in a decision useful way, and report it to their investors. The CDSB framework then helps companies to pull out what is most financially material in the context of the mainstream financial filings and integrate this information into these filings in a way that is suited for investor use and decision making. So together, CDP and CDSB provide companies with a complete tool to implement the TCFD recommendations, which are the North Star guiding companies forward to provide decision useful information to their investors. And if we would move on to the next slide, please. Before we kick off with an overview of what's happening in the market by government in terms of TCFD support, I wanted to briefly mention private sector support of the recommendation. So as of July this year, we have 825 supporters globally of the TCFD recommendations. These include companies, investors, business associations, and indeed some governments as well. But on the private sector side, it is estimated that these supporters are responsible for a combined $118 trillion. Of these supporters, there are also governments, and these are listed at the bottom of the slide, the UK being the first one to endorse the TCFD recommendation, and just this month, New Zealand being the latest country to endorse the recommendations. And with this, I'll hand back to Jenny to introduce today's the report that has been the basis of today's webinar.
Thank you. So, as Mike mentioned earlier this year, CDP and CDSB produced a roadmap for G7 governments in particular on adopting the TCFD recommendations. And this roadmap laid out possible avenues for mandating climate-related disclosure and embedding the TCFD recommendations into national legislation. The mandatory disclosure doesn't necessarily mean new legislation and a complete overhaul to the existing system. In fact, in many jurisdictions, tweaks could be made to existing legal and regulatory frameworks. And in fact, no new regulatory frameworks would be needed in some countries, but rather slight clarifications to existing requirements, coupled with proper guidance for supervising and enforcing existing rules. So in this roadmap, we laid out that now is the time for action. The benefits of a sustainable financial system really are sizable, and they now need to be seized. So through sustainable finance, G7 economies can really reap the full spectrum of benefits that are associated with decarbonisation. So that's ensuring that financial institutions become more resilient, businesses can access better priced and more patient capital, and they will be able to develop the products, skills and innovations that are increasingly needed to deliver a healthy financial sector and to promote financial stability. We also laid out in this roadmap that it's about national jurisdiction certainly, but disclosure and accounting in line with the TCFD recommendations can also be the bedrock for implementing Goal 2.1c or Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement, which is to make finance flows really consistent with that pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. So it's about national legislation certainly, but the TCFD recommendations can also support international frameworks and their goals. So if we move on to the next slide, now we're going to talk through a few different countries and what they're doing in terms of regulation and what they could do in the future as well. So looking at we'll kick off with France, and looking at existing legislation in France, only minor adjustments to existing French reporting practices would actually be required to really implement the TCFD recommendations. So this could include, for example, further alignment of Article 173 of the Energy Transition and Green Growth Law with the TCFD recommendations, and this article looks particularly at companies and financial institutions. And then on the supervisory side as well, this could include providing the French Markets Authority with the clear mandate and the funding to supervise ESG reporting. And we're also seeing further signals from France too. So just earlier this year, we saw an in-depth report that was released by the French Accounting Standards Board. This was sent to the Minister for the Economy and Finance, as I mentioned earlier this year, and that's entitled Ensuring the Relevance and Reliability of Non-Financial Corporate Information, an Ambition and a Competitive Advantage for a Sustainable Europe. And this report, it proposes to synthesize reporting standards at the national, EU and the global levels, and to define a standard extra financial reporting structure, which builds on existing standards, and that includes the TCFD recommendations. And then if we can move on to the next country, and Mike's going to talk a little bit about Japan.
Thank you, Jenny. Japan has really soared to the top in the past 12 months. Just last year, Japan was nowhere near in terms of the number of companies supporting the TCFD recommendations as compared to other more Western countries. But Japan has made a conscious decision to take the TCFD implementation as an area of friendly competition with other jurisdictions, and has now the highest number of TCFD supporters of any country. This was done, among others, with the support of the government, of various agencies and ministries in Japan, and they are very keen to position Japan as a leader in TCFD implementation. To do this, they have taken very practical steps, namely to set up the TCFD Implementation Coalition, which is a public-private partnership between the Japan Financial Services Agency, the supervisor, the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, and the Japan Exchange Group, as well as some corporate members and investor members. And they all worked on producing some guidance to support the implementation of the TCFD recommendations in Japan, both for, as I said, for the corporate side of things and also the investor side of things. They are also proactively collaborating with other financial centers globally, mainly, for example, through the Tokyo and City of London Finance Partnership and other partnerships. And as I mentioned, there are strong signals and strong involvement coming from the agencies and ministries that are responsible for finance. And there have been also a whole host of guidances produced to support the market and implement the TCFD. Jenny, you're over to present the UK.
Thanks. So in the case of the UK, mandatory reporting could entail tweaks to the Companies Act of 2006, as it was amended in 2013 and 2017, and that could incorporate the 11 recommended TCFD disclosures into the directors and all the strategic reports there. So that's on top of the existing obligation in the Companies Act to report on material risks, and that by its nature includes climate change where that's material. So further enhancing the supervisory powers of the UK's Financial Reporting Council could also prove beneficial. And just a few months ago, the UK released a new green finance strategy. And this was designed particularly to align private sector financial flows with clean, environmentally sustainable and resilient growth. And it also had the objective to strengthen the competitiveness of the UK financial sector. And with regards to disclosure, reporting and TCFD recommendations, within that new green finance strategy, the government has set out its expectation for all listed companies and large asset owners to disclose in line with the TCFD recommendation by 2022. And what it's going to also do is to establish a joint task force with UK regulators, and that will be chaired by the government. And that's going to look at examining the most effective way to approach disclosure. And that will include exploring the appropriateness of mandatory reporting. The kind of next steps around that, there's the intention to publish an interim report by the end of 2020 on the actions that government can take to green the UK's financial system. And that report will look at progress on the implementation of the TCFD recommendations. So this is all laid out in this new green finance strategy. So it'll be interesting to see how that progresses. If we move on to the next slide, Mike's going to talk through Canada.
Canada's involvement with the TCFD has really started last year with its G7 presidency. But even before that, there has already been some interesting movement by the Canadian Securities Authorities, that is the group of provincial securities authorities supervising the market. Back, I believe, in 2010, they have produced a staff notice, essentially an interpretive guidance on the reporting of climate change-related risks, where they have made it clear that climate-related risks can, in fact, have financially material implications and should therefore be considered as any other financially material risk when looking at what to disclose. Last year, however, there has been more movement, especially because the staff notice has not produced the outcome that was desired. And so, on the provincial level, the CSA, the securities authorities, have started to work more deeply on the TCFD recommendations in particular, and on the federal level, Climate Change Canada and Finance Canada have started the expert panel on sustainable finance, a group of influential and expert individuals in Canada to come up with some recommendations on how to make the financial system in Canada more sustainable. The expert panel has then produced an interim report and a final report. And in its final report, it has recommended that Canada endorse a phased comply or explain approach to adoption of the TCFD recommendations for Canada. In addition, for Canada to provide clarity to issuers on the scope and pace of the TCFD implementation, again, to help the market care and implement recommendations in an orderly and structured fashion, and also to work with federal and provincial and industry partners to clarify the materiality of climate-related financial disclosures, again, to make sure that it's clear to the market what is expected of them and what is considered material. In addition, just a few weeks ago, the CSA has published another staff notice on climate disclosures, and has taken a more of a governance phased approach, and have provided some guidance on implementing the TCFD recommendations from a governance point of view. We will see, of course, how this will impact the market, and whether it will take the same fate as the previous notice, or whether it will have more traction. However, in addition to this, there are other avenues to implementing the TCFD recommendations. On the federal level, there is the Canadian Business Corporation Act, which sets out a basic requirement to provide an annual report, and there has been an amendment that on diversity disclosure, so a similar amendment could be made for climate-related financial disclosures, or perhaps on the provincial level, the CSA, the group of segregated authorities, have some national instruments in place, one on continuous disclosure obligations and one on disclosure of corporate governance practices, which really go into a lot more detail of how to, what these annual reports should contain, and then that could be amended or clarified to include climate-related financial disclosures as well. Over to you, Jenny.
So taking a look at the US now. So most recently in the US, we've actually seen a growing interest in ESG, environmental, social and governance reporting, and that includes climate disclosure. So we've seen Senator Warren proposing the Climate Risk Disclosure Act 2019, which, if passed, would require public companies to disclose to the Securities and Exchange Commission information about climate risk to business. So this, whether or not the bill will be approved by the House and Senate remains to be seen, but it does demonstrate the mounting support and interest in climate-related reporting. In the US, Regulation SK does already require listed companies to provide disclosure on among other items, a description of the business, legal proceedings, risk factors, and the management discussion and analysis. And the Securities and Exchanges Commission's guidance regarding disclosure related to climate change, this is guidance of 2010, states that depending on the facts and circumstances of a particular registrant, each of those items that is listed on that slide may require disclosure regarding the impact of climate change. So there are provisions already there, but though this is helpful, evaluating the disclosure that's related to those items and to that guidance hasn't been an enforcement priority for the Securities and Exchange Commission as of yet. So a potential avenue could be for that commission to enforce those climate-related disclosures that are in line with that regulation, and also in line with that with the guidance regarding disclosure related to climate change. So if we move on to the next slide, and Mike's going to talk you through the next few countries.
Thank you, Jenny. Another area of very active movement is the European Union. In the EU, we already have the Non-Financial Reporting Directive, which requires companies to provide environmental, social, and other governance-related disclosures in their management reports, their annual reports, and this provides a very good basis for implementing the TCFD as well. The European Commission has been quite supportive of the TCFD recommendations, and in fact has included a Sustainable Finance Action Plan, some plans to embed this in the European policy framework. The first step to do this was to set up a technical expert group on sustainable finance, which contained a subgroup on climate-related financial disclosures. CDP was a member of this technical expert group, and this group has produced guidelines which were later on adopted by the European Commission as non-binding guidelines on reporting climate-related information, and they are very much framed around how to use the TCFD recommendations in the context of this non-financial reporting directive. The guidelines are of course very helpful, but they are by definition non-binding, so I'm sure they will be helpful for the market, but it is for us to see whether it will bring the impact at the scale that is needed for addressing this issue of climate-related financial risk. However, at the same time, at various public fora, the EU Commission has been very vocal about the fact that they would be surprised if the non-financial reporting was not reopened, as we had to the new Commission and Parliament after the elections. So we might see some amendments coming in sooner than we expect. In addition to this, there are other initiatives happening in Europe, such as the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group's Project Task Force on Climate-Related Reporting, of which I'm a member, and we are working on producing additional guidance on climate-related financial disclosures, and especially various aspects of the TCFD recommendations to also help the market in implementing these recommendations. As I mentioned, in Europe, the non-financial reporting directive provides a very good basis to implement the recommendations, so it would be an excellent way to implement these, to amending the directive, as well as through the accounting directive, which actually is the non-financial reporting directive, amends some specific elements on corporate governance could be included there as well, and the TCFD could be quite easily implemented through these two directives. In addition, the European Securities and Markets Authorities, or ESMA, and their member state equivalents could then take on more stringent supervision of such reporting, and recently we have seen some very good signals from ESMA that they're starting to take this issue more and more seriously. So it might be that the EU will end up being the first country to cross the barrier and actually make TCFD mandatory. Where of course we don't have a crystal ball, so we can't tell the future, but it is very promising in Europe. Moving on to Australia. The Australian political context has been very varied in the past, and climate change has been moving up and down on the agenda. But at the same time, various government departments and government-affiliated organizations have been making steady progress. I'd like to highlight two elements of this progress. First of them being the Australian Accounting Standards Board and the Accounting and Audit Standards Board of Australia, who has produced a joint practice statement on climate-related and other emerging risk disclosures, where they have focused in on the fact that climate change is a very unique and material issue. They have made a very helpful and practical decision tree for the market players to use to decide whether climate change is in fact material for them, and then they have proceeded to explain how climate-related matters relate to various Australian financial reporting standards. Those are, of course, the Australian implementation of international financial reporting standards. So even if you are not incorporated in Australia, I highly recommend that you look at this project statement because this provides some very useful narrative and interpretation of existing financial reporting standards and how they relate to the TCFD recommendations. In addition, again, only recently, the Australian Securities Investment body, the supervisor, has also updated two of its regulatory guides, which you see at the bottom of the screen, and has very clearly come out to say that climate change is a systemic risk and it is a very pertinent issue that must be taken into account. So rather than through legislation, Australia has been steadily moving to embed the TCFD thinking and its requirements into its framework of existing financial reporting standards and financial supervision. And this really speaks to the heart of the TCFD recommendations. They are at their core, they are financial reporting measures as opposed to some previous greenhouse gas reporting requirements. Moving on to the next slide, New Zealand has also been quietly moving forward on the TCFD. This started a few years back through a report by the Productivity Commission, in which the Commission has recommended that the New Zealand government should implement climate-related financial disclosure requirements by way of the Financial Reporting Act of 2013. These disclosures should be audited and accessible for the general public. Government has just a few weeks ago as well responded to this, and in general they agreed with this recommendation. However, they of course want to make sure that they do this right. They've been very clear about the fact that they see climate change as a one-shot deal. It is important to get it right sooner rather than later. However, they want to make sure that the Financial Reporting Act is in fact the most appropriate means for implementing the recommendation, whether there is anything they need to consider regarding which entities should be reporting and what exactly the disclosure requirements should be. So New Zealand is up there with the EU in terms of the race to the top of implementing the TCFD recommendation. And our last and final contendant is Chile. I had the pleasure of visiting the country just last week and have seen a whole host of initiatives happening there. First of all, there are already some public-private partnerships and working groups happening, namely the Chilean Sustainable Finance Public-Private Working Group, where various government departments and regulators, including the pension regulator, are working with key private sector representatives to put together a roadmap for Chile up to COP25 and the presidency, and of course beyond. There is also a very exciting initiative spearheaded by EY Chile, working on sector-specific transition plans for some of Chile's key sectors to ensure that they really transform the entire financial system and make it more resilient in the challenges they might be facing in the future. Last but not least, and this really happened last week, the chair of the Chilean Markets Authority, Joaquin Cortés, has announced that they will be looking at mandatory reporting requirements as an amendment to Norma de Character number 30. They will be delivering complete, consistent, and decision-useful information to investors, and he noted that we should be expecting a public consultation in the next few weeks. So it's something definitely to keep an eye on. So we'll see what the content of this draft legislation will be, but it seems to me that there is a lot of support, a lot of interest to move quickly in Chile, both because of their COP presidency this year, but also because it is seen as a very important issue in Chile. And with that, I'll hand it over to Jenny to begin wrapping up.
Thanks, Mike. So, yeah, I mean, we've talked a lot about a number of different countries and what regulations they have in place, what signals we're seeing, to try and answer that question that we posed at the start. So, are we heading towards mandatory disclosure? So, to try and summarize, we haven't covered all the jurisdictions that we could have done. For example, particularly in China, we would have loved to have got into that in a little bit more detail. In early March, the China Securities Regulatory Commission, CDSB, have issued new boards in relation to science and technology and innovation, and the Shanghai Stock Exchange issued some guidance around those board stock listing rules, and some of those rules include those companies taking action in relation to ESG-related requirements, and we may see further action and movement from the CSRC, in the coming months as well. So, there's a lot happening. We would have loved to have covered it all in a bit more detail. And Mike, it's kind of a case of not if, but when and who. So, if you want to talk that through a little bit more.
Absolutely. I hope that through this presentation, and we could have gone on for much longer, you can see that it really looks like it is a race to the top. As I said, we can't predict the future, and we wouldn't want to make any guesses on what will happen in the future. But the TCFD recommendations have gone well beyond their initially intended voluntary status, and this really speaks to the recognition by the market and by society at large of the significance of these issues around climate change, the financial stability of our economy, and the need to address these in a swift manner. So, in the next few months, I'm sure we'll be hearing more countries make similar statements, and I wouldn't be surprised to hear one of these countries moving forward to actually converting their support of the TCFD recommendations to a mandatory status.
And I think part of that is that in many cases, as we outlined, it's more of an evolution of existing regulatory frameworks rather than a kind of revolution that's needed. So in lots of cases, it's sort of small tweaks and enforcement of existing guidance that could actually enable the TCFD recommendations to be implemented in these jurisdictions. So yeah, that was it's that evolution rather than revolution point, I think, is quite important.
Absolutely, and as this process keeps moving, it's important that governments keep the TCFD recommendations as their guiding star, as their focal point. Of course, it is every government needs to take into account its own policy landscape and its regulations, and must find a way to implement the recommendations in a way that suits its market. And we've seen it even through this presentation that there are various paths to implementing the recommendations. But as they go through this process, it's important to stick to the TCFD recommendations as much as possible, to keep true to these recommendations, because any divergence from them can result in slight differences between markets and therefore might affect the comparability of the information that is reported to really an international investor base.
Yeah, and finally, just to say that it's that the TCFD recommendations are really important. Obviously in those national jurisdictions and within those countries that we've looked through, but just to kind of end on the point that it's not. These recommendations are also really valuable for strengthening progress towards the goals of international frameworks. So, for example, the Paris Agreement, we mentioned before, but just to kind of end on this, that it's really the bedrock for implementing the Paris Agreement, Article 2.1c. So we're all familiar with the temperature goals in relation to the Paris Agreement, but there is this key third goal. It's around mitigation, adaptation, and also about ensuring that finance really flows in a consistent pathway towards the goals of the Paris, the temperature goals, so towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. And disclosure and accounting that's in line with the TCFD recommendations can really ensure this. So yeah, we'll leave our presentation there, and then I think we have time for a few questions.
Yes, we do indeed, and thank you very much to both Michael and Jenny for such an informative webinar. There was a lot of content in that, all highly interesting, and I'm sure it gives everyone plenty of food for thought. We will be distributing the slides and recording of this webinar afterwards, so you will have those to share with your colleagues as well if you would like. We do encourage you to contact Michael and Jenny separately as well if you have any questions, or if we don't have the opportunity to address your questions during the Q&A. So with that, as Jenny mentioned, we do have a short amount of time for questions, so we will try and get through as many of those as we can. So firstly, the first question is looking at critical mass, and I think both Michael and Jenny could probably answer this. So when do you think sufficient critical mass will be achieved to drive change in countries where perhaps the governments are less supportive or hostile towards climate disclosure?
Should I jump in quickly then, Mike, and then I'll let you cover it. I mean, Mike and I have been working on this topic for a long time, and I think really in the last year, we've seen a lot of movement and a lot of signals coming from many different countries on this topic, and that's been really interesting to see. We've talked about the G7 governments, within this roadmap we produced, but there's governments that are outside the G7 that are looking at this, and I think certainly within the last year, there's really been that kind of awakening to the importance of disclosure for managing risk. Mike, I don't know if you want to go over anything in a bit more detail there, but I think certainly in this last year we've really seen a lot of movement, and it's been very exciting to see.
I completely agree with you, Jenny, and you've really hit the nail on the head with your last comment. The difference here is that we are no longer looking at ministries of environment promoting climate disclosure from their perspective, but it's really becoming a financial issue, and it has taken a much less subjective lens, very much a finance driven perspective. So the fact that we now have ministries of finance, central banks, and others in this space going out there and speaking about this from their perspective, it really shows that the perception of this issue has shifted to a whole new level.
Okay, thank you very much. And Michael, I believe this question might be best answered by yourself. So this relates to the FRC's Streamlined Energy and Carbon Reporting Taxonomy. So at the moment, they're consulting on whether to include the TCFD within this taxonomy. What do you think the significance of the TCFD being included will be if it goes ahead?
A very good question. I'll be brief in my answer. There's a lot more to say about this, but this streamlined energy and carbon reporting came from that environmental side of things, and it really has come from the fact that there are many energy efficiency and other reporting requirements that companies must comply with, and there is a certain amount of overlap to this more TCFD style reporting that is coming in these days. And so the UK government has recognized this and thought that they could reduce the reporting burden and make companies' lives more efficient by recognizing the overlaps and streamlining the reporting framework of the UK. So they have taken an approach to request aligned information once rather than through various channels, and they have done this through the Companies Act requirements, essentially the annual reporting requirements. But as such, it does relate to the TCFD by making it easier and making companies' lives easier. But it is really just an element of a wide range of recommendations that the TCFD covers. On the digital side of things, I don't want to go into too much detail. This consultation has some digital reporting questions as well. All I'd like to say here is that financial reporting is moving to digital. It is a welcome move, but it is important that we don't unnaturally separate so-called non-financial related financial information by keeping it in the analog world. So it is important that any type of financially material reporting is presented in the same format and is evolved at the same pace.
Thank you very much. And I think we have time for one last final question. And this relates to both CDSB and CDP. So hopefully, Mike and Jenny, you can both feed in. The question is saying that both the CDSB framework and the CDP questionnaire are recommended by the TCFD. But it appears that maybe more specific requirements and a common methodology is needed. So our question is, will CDP move forward to specify the recommendations, and how does CDSB view this as well?
Thanks, Leslie. Maybe I'll just take this to the CDP element of that. So this was, this is a new area for many companies. So guidance will evolve in relation to this. From CDP side, we do have resources. We do have resources available for companies to look at this. We've got a technical note that goes into sort of detail about scenario analysis. We've got lots of in-depth guidance on the website. So I do encourage any companies that are that are thinking about this topic or want to know more to kind of get in touch with us on this, because there is a certain amount of guidance, and we do have technical notes available. And I think our technical team would be interested to talk to anyone who feels that more guidance or technical notes are needed. Mike, maybe you want to cover that from the CDSB angle as well.
Sure. As Jay said, there is excellent guidance by CDP, and of course, CDSB has produced TCFD specific guidance, and both the CDSB questionnaires and the CDSB framework are aligned with the TCFD recommendations. In addition, CDSB hosts, on behalf of the TCFD, the TCFD Knowledge Hub, tcfdhub.org, which is exactly a place for companies to go to find the resources they need to implement the recommendations. So if I am a steel producing company in Brazil and I'm looking for guidance on scenario analysis, and then I can filter by those categories and find what is needed. I think there is much more work that needs to be done in bringing visibility to the existing body of work that is out there to support companies, because it is not well known, and then we often hear that companies can find the guidance they're looking for. So this is what the TCFD app has been set up for. In addition, we will also be launching some e-learning courses to really solidify the company's knowledge out there on the TCFD recommendations through the hub. So please watch that space. And as Jenny said, we are of course also very open to hearing from the market around the gaps that might exist. We don't want to pretend that there are no gaps, of course. This is still evolving practice, but both organizations are very keen to work with the market to support them in implementing the CCFD recommendation.
Thanks, Mike. And I just see there was a bit of that question that I didn't quite cover as well, and that was in relation to I think you mentioned the finance sector, is that right, Lizzie? Yeah. Just to let you know that CDP is working on finalising a 2020 questionnaire for financial institutions as well, and the objectives will be to finalise indicators and to develop guidance and technical notes on those Scope 3 methodologies, particularly for the finance sector. It will focus on banks and insurers, but it will also include asset managers and will align with the PRI on investor questions. So that is also coming up. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Jenny, for that additional information as well. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today, so we do thank everyone for participating. We've had loads of questions come through, and we really do value all your feedback and your interest in the topic. As I mentioned, please do feel free to reach out to either Michael or Jenny directly if you have more questions. We will be distributing the slides and recording of this webinar. And once again, thank you very much for participating, and we do hope to see you on future webinars. Have a lovely day. Bye-bye.